There's something about The Exorcist that feels like it doesn't begin when the movie begins. That might sound strange, but it's one of the reasons the film still has the power that it does. A lot of horror movies introduce evil as an interruption to the status quo. Something breaks into the world of the story, a killer arrives, a house is disturbed, a curse is triggered. But The Exorcist opens with the sense that the evil that we're about to encounter was already there. Before Georgetown, before Regan, before Chris MacNeil ever hears a sound in the attic. The film begins in Iraq, among ruins, dust, heat, fragments of a history that should have stayed buried. And Father Merrin standing in a place where the modern world feels very thin. That opening matters because Merrin isn't discovering evil as a concept. He's recognizing something that he's seen before. When he sees the amulet and later the statue of Pazuzu, the film doesn't need him to explain everything to us. His face does the work. He knows. And that recognition is the first theological weight that the movie puts on the table. This is not random. This is not a psychological episode dressed up in religious imagery. This is an ancient hostility, something that has been opposed before, something that has a history with humanity, something that predates the characters, and in a sense, has been waiting for another confrontation. That's why the Iraq sequence feels so different from the rest of the film, and yet it quietly controls the whole thing. We're not in a haunted house yet. We're in the ruins of past civilizations. We're among old gods, old fears, old spiritual conflicts, and old forms of worship. Merrin stands in that world like a man who has learned that evil is not merely an idea that people invented to explain pain. Evil is active. Evil has presence. Evil has weight and memory. And the great mistake of the modern characters who come later is not that they're unintelligent or careless. It's that they live in a world that has almost forgotten how to name what Merrin recognizes instantly. Then the film cuts to Georgetown, and the shift is almost jarring. We move from ancient stone and desert heat to a recognizable modern world. Chris MacNeil is an actress, working mother, a woman with a career, a home, friends, frustrations, and a daughter she loves. Regan is not introduced with an eerie air about her. She's not marked or strange. She's just a kid. She's playful, affectionate, curious, and by every standard and measurement, ordinary in the best sense of the word. The movie gives us domestic warmth because it wants us to understand what's about to be violated. It does not begin with the grotesque because the grotesque only matters if we first see the good that it's interrupting. That's one of the things The Exorcist understands so well. Evil isn't interesting because it's powerful. Evil is horrifying because of what it does to what is good. Regan's innocence matters. Chris's love matters. The home matters. The bedroom matters. These are not neutral spaces. They are places of care, rest, childhood, and protection. So, when the invasion begins, it's not just scary, it's obscene. It's a desecration. And the invasion begins quietly. That's important. There's noise in the attic. There are small changes in Regan's behavior. There are things that can still be brushed aside or explained. She plays with the Ouija board and talks about Captain Howdy, and at first, it has the shape of a child's imagination. It's odd, maybe even a little unsettling, but not yet undeniable. And that's how the film begins its descent. It doesn't drag us immediately into supernatural certainty. It lets ambiguity do its work. We're placed where Chris is placed, trying to explain what's happening with the categories available. And those categories are modern, medical, psychological. Chris does what a caring mother would do. She seeks help, doctors examine Regan, specialists are consulted, tests are run, machines scan her body, needles go in, blood is drawn, her suffering is measured, photographed, prodded, and interpreted. These scenes are often overlooked because people remember the possession imagery, and for good reason. But the medical sequences are some of the most disturbing parts of the film. They're disturbing because they show a child being subjected to the full machinery of modern explanation. and none of it can reach what's actually happening. That does not mean the movie is anti-science. That would be far too simple. The film is not saying that doctors are foolish. It's saying that their tools are real but insufficient, limited. They can examine the brain, they can observe symptoms, they can propose disorders, but they cannot name a will that hides behind symptoms. They cannot diagnose malice as malice. They cannot treat spiritual invasion as spiritual invasion because their framework does not allow for it. This is where the movie starts to become terrifying in a deeper way, because as long as Regan's condition can be medicalized, it remains inside a world that we can manage. It may be frightening, but it's still familiar. There are experts, there are hospitals, there are treatments, there are explanations, but the longer the film goes on, the more the explanations begin to fail. And when the explanations fail, Chris is not simply left without answers. She's left in the presence of something that seems to recognize her, that seems to know her. That's the shift. Regan is not merely deteriorating. Something is acting through her. Something is using her. Something is taking the child Chris loves and making her body, her voice, her face, and her room into instruments of violation. The horror of possession is not just that a demon enters the body, it's that the person becomes a battleground. The body is still Regan's, but it's being used against her. Her voice is still coming from her throat, but it's not her voice. Her face is still recognizable, but increasingly obscured by something that wants to erase all recognition. This is why possession is such a uniquely disturbing category of horror. It collapses the boundary between self and invader. The enemy is not outside the door. The enemy is speaking from the bed. This is where the Exorcist refuses to soften evil. The entity does not simply want to kill Regan. If death were the only goal, the story would be a lot simpler. What the demon does is more degrading than murder. It humiliates. It sexualizes. It blasphemes. It mocks love. It attacks innocence. It turns a child's bedroom into a form of anti-sanctuary, a space of filth, cold, profanity, and spiritual contempt. The room becomes a kind of inverted holy place, not because anything is holy that's happening there, but because the battle has become explicitly spiritual. The ordinary signs of childhood are swallowed by something that wants not merely to frighten, but to truly defile. That word matters here, defile, because evil in this film is not just violence, it's desecration. It takes what should be protected and makes it obscene. It takes speech and turns it into accusation. It takes a child's body and turns it into a weapon. It takes a mother's love and turns it into helpless anguish. It takes a priest's grief and turns it into temptation. That brings us to Father Karras. Karras is not a side character. He's one of the reasons the film works as more than a possession story. If Regan is the site of the invasion, Karras is the man being prepared for confrontation without realizing it. He's a priest, but not a triumphant one. He's exhausted. He's grieving. He's full of guilt over his mother. He feels like he's failed her. He feels like he's failing as a priest. His faith isn't gone, but it is wounded. He still wears the collar, but internally he's fraying. And the film is wise to take its time with him because Karras' crisis is not decorative. It is essential. He's not simply the religious expert who arrives to solve the supernatural problem. He is himself vulnerable. The demon sees that. The demon uses that. And that's one of the most theologically serious things the film understands. Evil does not only attack strength, it studies fracture. When Karras first becomes involved, he does not rush to believe. He's skeptical at first. He asks plenty of questions. He looks for evidence. He approaches Regan not as a mystic eager to prove possession, but as a priest trained in psychology who knows that many supposed possessions are not possessions at all and that restraint matters. It makes the eventual recognition all the heavier. If everyone instantly believed, the film would become fantasy. Instead, Karras has to be dragged. piece by piece, toward the truth. And the demon knows how to drag him. It does not merely perform supernatural tricks, it reaches into his grief. It mimics his mother, it exploits the wound he carries most deeply. And that's not random horror, that is spiritual cruelty with exact precision. The demon's aim is not simply to prove that it exists, it wants to weaken the one who might stand against it. It wants Karras to collapse under the weight of his own guilt. It wants him to doubt not only God, but himself. That's what makes the conversations between Karras and the possessed Regan so unsettling. The demon is not just a monster growling from a bed, it's an accuser. And accusation is one of evil's oldest languages. It takes what is true, half true, or painfully unresolved and weaponizes it, all in the name of manipulation. Karras did fail to be present for his mother in the way that he wanted. His guilt is not invented out of nothing, but evil never uses truth to heal. It uses truth to condemn. It takes the wound and presses until the person begins to believe the wound is the whole story. Meanwhile, Chris is trapped in a different kind of torment. Her role in the film is sometimes reduced to terrified mother, but it's deeper than that. Chris is the modern person forced into a reality that she does not have language for. She's not irreligious in a cartoonish kind of way. She's simply not prepared for this. Her world is one of work, relationships, doctors, institutions, and human resolutions. But now the person she loves most is suffering in a way no institution seems to be able to explain or stop. That helplessness is part of the horror. And it's worth sitting with that. Because one of the cruelest aspects of evil is that it isolates everyone. Chris is isolated by disbelief and desperation. Regan is isolated inside of her own body. Karras is isolated by doubt and guilt. Merrin, when he arrives, is isolated by knowledge. Each character faces the evil from a different angle, and each angle reveals something about its nature. By the time Father Merrin comes to Georgetown, the film has already made the room feel like a place under occupation. The atmosphere changes, the cold becomes more than just temperature. The bed, the walls, the air itself feel hostile and polluted. And Merrin enters the space differently than everyone else because Merrin knows what it is. He doesn't need to be persuaded in the same way. He's encountered this ancient opposition before. He knows that the demon's theatrics are not the point. The obscenity, the voices, the violence, the blasphemy, all of it is part of the assault. But beneath it is a will that hates. This is where the movie's theological weight becomes unavoidable. The demon is not merely trying to maintain Regan. It is trying to dominate the meaning of the room. It wants everyone who enters to see only its power, its filth, its mockery, its ability to degrade. It wants to make evil feel like the ultimate power. And that's one of the oldest strategies of darkness, not merely to hurt, but to convince the sufferer that the hurt is the deepest truth of reality. And Merrin understands that. And so the exorcism isn't about a specific magic ritual with all of the right words and phrases. It's not a spell battle. It's a confrontation of authority. The words matter, but not because Latin symbols and syllables have mechanical force. They matter because they invoke a higher authority than the thing in the room. That's why the demon rages. It's not offended by religion as decoration. It's offended by authority that it cannot finally possess. The exorcism itself is grueling because the film refuses the fantasy of simple spiritual victory. This is not a quick deliverance scene. It's laborious. The priests are worn down. The repetition becomes part of the point. The room becomes a battlefield of endurance. The demon mocks them, assaults them, tries to divide them, tries to provoke them. It wants anger. It wants despair. It wants them to engage on its terms. And that's crucial. Evil wants to set the terms of the fight. If it can make the priests respond with pride, hatred, panic, or despair, then it's already bent them toward itself. That's why Merrin warns Karras, don't listen. Not because the words are meaningless, but because they're dangerous. The demon's speech is not communication, it's poison. It's designed to enter the listener and work from the inside out. And then Merrin dies. And the film makes that death feel devastatingly quiet in comparison to the chaos around it. He's come as the experienced exorcist, like the final hope in the darkest hour, the one who understands the enemy. And yet he doesn't survive the confrontation. That's not because evil is stronger than God. The film's not saying that, but it is saying something serious. Those who confront darkness are not untouched by it. Spiritual authority is not the same thing as personal invulnerability. The battle costs something. And now Karras is alone. This is the moment the film has been building toward from the beginning of his story. Not merely whether Regan can be saved, but whether Karras, wounded and doubting as he is, can become the man required in that room. And what he does is astonishing. He doesn't solve the problem intellectually. He doesn't find a hidden rule or a loophole. He offers himself. He commands the demon to take him. And for a moment, the evil that has been working through Regan enters Karras. You can see the fight on his face. The possession moves into him. And the question becomes whether he will become another instrument of desecration. But he doesn't. He throws himself out the window. That act is often described as sacrifice, and it is, but we need to be precise about what kind of sacrifice it is. It's not sentimental, and it's not clean. It's not graceful martyrdom staged with glowing music. It's violent, desperate, and bodily. Karras takes the evil into himself and then refuses to let it continue through him. He breaks the chain with his own body. And theologically, this is the deepest contrast of the film. The demon takes bodies in order to use them. Karras gives his body in order to save another. The demon possesses Karras's offerings. The demon consumes Karras's sacrifices. The demon can imitate voices, faces, memories, and authority, but it cannot produce love. It cannot produce self-giving. It cannot create the thing that defeats it. And there is no greater love than giving your life for another. That's why the ending is so powerful without being easy. Regan is free. Chris receives her daughter back. But the film does not pretend that nothing happened. It does not erase the horror. The cost remains. Karras is dead. Merrin is dead. The room has been a place of unspeakable violation, and Regan, even if she does not remember everything, has been at the center of a battle that no child should ever have to endure. The final movement of the film is quieter, and that quiet matters. After so much noise, obscenity, and violence, the ordinary world returns, but it doesn't return untouched. The silence after the exorcism is not simple relief. It's the silence after something real has passed through. And this is where the rest of the franchise has always struggled, because the original establishes something incredibly difficult to continue. It establishes evil as ancient, personal, intelligent, and invasive. But it also keeps that evil mysterious. It gives us enough to feel the weight without turning the demon into a lore machine. Later films often try to expand what the first film implies. And that is understandable when you're trying to make a movie franchise. The temptation is obvious. If the first movie gives us an ancient evil, then sequels naturally want to ask where it came from, how it works, what else it has done, and how far its influence reaches. But the danger is that explanation can reduce dread. Exorcist 2, The Heretic, tries to expand the mythology and push into broader spiritual ideas. But in doing so, it loses the terrifying intimacy of the original. It wants to make the evil bigger, but bigger is not always heavier. The first film is frightening because one room becomes the place where ancient evil and human vulnerability collide. When the mythology becomes too diverse, the weight can evaporate. The Exorcist 3, on the other hand, understands something closer to the original's power. It returns to the idea that evil persists, that it moves through persons, that it uses bodies, voices, identity, and suffering as instruments. It has a different shape than the first film, but it remembers that the horror is not just demonic spectacle. It's the horror of personality invaded, distorted, and extended beyond death. It understands that evil is not merely an event. It's a continuity. The prequels, in their different forms, try to return to Merrin and show us earlier encounters with darkness, and even when those films are uneven, the impulse makes sense, because the original Iraq sequence begs for that kind of imagination. Merrin has faced something before. He carries history. He's not simply a priest summoned to a case. He is a man marked by prior confrontation. But again, the challenge is that showing too much can make the darkness feel smaller. The first film knows the power of suggestion. It lets Merrin's face tell us that there is a past without requiring that past to be fully mapped. And then the newer continuation films try to bring possession into a contemporary framework, asking what happens when an old evil resurfaces in a world even less equipped to name it. That's a strong idea in theory, because if anything, our world is more like Chris MacNeil's world than Merrin's. We are surrounded by technologies, diagnoses, institutions, and explanations, and many of those are good, but we are often spiritually illiterate. We know how to describe symptoms. We are less confident naming evil. A sequel that really understood the original would not just repeat possession imagery, it would ask what ancient evil looks like when it enters a world that has lost the language of deliverance. That's the standard that the original sets. It's not enough to have a possessed body. It's not enough to have profanity, contortion, levitation, and religious objects in a let's find the right series of religious power to overcome the evil. The real power of The Exorcist is that it treats possession as a theological crisis. A human person is under assault. A mother's love is being tortured. A priest's guilt is being weaponized. An old warrior of faith is stepping once more into the presence of something he knows to be real. The room becomes a battlefield, not between superstition and science, but between desecration and sacrifice. And that, I think, is why The Exorcist still feels so unsettling. It does not merely ask, what if demons are real? That would be frightening enough, but the deeper question is, what if evil is personal enough to know where you're weakest? What if it doesn't want to hurt you, but to profane what you love? What if it is ancient, patient, intelligent, and cruel? What if it cannot create, but can twist creation against itself? What if the human person is more vulnerable than modern confidence wants to admit? But the film does not leave us only there. It also asks another question. What kind of love can stand in front of that? Not optimism, not denial, not vague spirituality, not the comforting idea that everything works out if you believe hard enough. The love that stands against evil in The Exorcist is costly. It is embodied. It goes into the room. It does not pretend the demon is harmless. It does not underestimate the darkness, but it also does not allow the darkness to be ultimate. And that's the key. The movie gives evil weight, but not finality. And that's a deeply Christian instinct. Whether viewers recognize it or not, evil is real. Evil is not an illusion. Evil is not merely the absence of education or therapy or better social conditions, though those things matter in their own ways, for sure. Evil can be chosen. Evil can invade. Evil can mock the holy, degrade the innocent, and speak with intelligence. But evil is also parasitic. It cannot create goodness. It cannot generate love. It cannot make a soul. It can only corrupt what has already been given to it. That's why Karras' final act matters so much. The demon has spent the film taking Regan's body, taking Chris's peace, taking Karras' guilt and turning it into accusation, taking language and making it filthy, taking the sacred and making it grotesque. And then Karras does the opposite. He gives himself to save a child. And in that moment, the demon encounters something that it cannot counterfeit, self-giving love. That's not a soft ending. That's not sentimental. It's bloody and terrible and tragic. But it's also the film's answer. Not a full answer to every question, not a neat solution to the mystery of evil, but an answer enacted in flesh. The Exorcist endures because it understands that darkness is not defeated by refusing to look at it. It is defeated, if defeated at all, by entering the room with eyes open, naming it for what it is, and refusing to let it have the final word. That's why the film still feels dangerous. Not because it shocks, at least not by modern standards, not because of the controversy, not because of the famous scenes that everybody remembers. It feels dangerous because it takes seriously the possibility that the spiritual world is real, that evil is not passive, and that human beings are not merely bodies moving through a neutral universe. Regan's bedroom becomes the place where all of that is revealed. The modern world brings its machines. The mother brings her love. The priests bring their doubt. The old exorcist brings his recognition, and the demon brings its hatred. And by the end, what remains is not comfort exactly. It's something harder than that. A sense that evil is worse than we want to believe, but also that love, when it truly gives itself, is stranger and stronger than evil can ever understand. If you enjoyed this retrospective and you want to hear more, make sure that you subscribe and leave a comment down below and let me know what other movies you want to hear me cover. Until next time.